going to begin, and we're gonna figure it out. So we're gonna figure it out
That
together.
sounds great. That sounds awesome.
So we're recording. I'm here with David, and he's dressed very nicely in a beautiful. I mean, I'm really jealous of this shirt right now. I've got on like
Well, yeah,
this
dress for
sad.
success. That's what I say.
Yeah.
I mean, if you feel good, you look good, you feel good, then things come naturally. No, this is just how I dress. I feel like in an office there are some certain ground rules that are useful, even though if it's academics, they can roll in with their sweatshirts. So best be dressed because who knows who you meet, who you hop on a call with. So c'est la vie. Yeah. Anyway.
So let's talk a little bit about academics. I think there's probably two extremes. One would say that like the only problem with academia is it's too hypocritical. They don't adhere to their values strongly enough, their moral values, that is. And then the opposite criticism would be that academia is so corrupted, or we should just say more specifically, the scientific process has become moralized. It's no longer objective. And as a result, the science that comes out of academia is totally useless. There's no smart people left. It's all just moralists and, hall monitors and whatever. Where do you come down? I mean, you're in the thick of it, so I'm going to guess you think there's some utility to it, but tell me, which of those perspectives has merit, or maybe a little bit of both?
So right, I guess I am in the thick of it. My background, I suppose, is I have relations to the Ivy League, and right now, I guess you could say I'm at one of the biggest, or not biggest, but per se the number one public Ivy, I suppose one could argue. So research is very heavy, and that's definitely the nature of it. However, I would say that I'll just start by prefacing that I'm an institutionalist. We talk about this a lot in the law. There's been a handful of Supreme Court decisions. Now, I'll just preface my background. I'm doing dual work within neuroscience and law, so I have both camps. And so in the neurosciences, particularly the cognitive neurosciences, these political decisions are sort of have a toe in certain arenas, particularly in political decision making or decision making research, broadly speaking. I think there's been a growth of people making sets of decisions over religions, people who are religious being smarter than other people or more reflective than other people. And there's a set of different types of skills and tests that people use. Take, for example, the critical reflection test as kind of the main behavioral test that people use. Consider like the type 1, type 2 thinking that people have with the Kahneman and Tversky stuff. And I think that a lot of that research is certainly going to get looked at a little differently. But in the sort of legal side, of course, the legal academia world is, shall I say, incredibly progressive. People don't think that, mostly because our Supreme Court and other legal branches, particularly like the Fifth Circuit, is rather conservative, but that is because there's been a conceded effort on the part since basically Roe v. Wade was passed to really develop a coherent conservative jurisprudence. And I find myself as a Federalist Society member and somewhat more of a conservative. I would say more libertarian conservative than anything else. I find myself that yeah, it's legal academia, especially here at this law school, is intense. So when it comes to the hypocrisy component, but this is all to say that as an institutionalist, our greatest sense-making institutions is in fact academia. Most of our research comes through here, even at a place like where I'm at, where the internet was invented. And if you think about what OpenAI did with Jeff Hinton and that, they developed out of University of Toronto. A lot of cogneuro people, computational neuroscientists were developed out of academia. That a lot of the groundwork for AI was built in these institutions. And while there is a growth of X studies, I think that certainly with the encampments, particularly at the institution I'm at, and my former institutions too, it really is a small, very loud contingent of the professoriate and as well as the graduate students, PhDs, that are like this. And it really also is self-sampling. I'll just note that, take for example the social psychologists or the clinical psychologists. A lot of them are very loud and make major demands upon departments and upon the administrations. But in the more math-heavy disciplines, we don't care very much. I find that there is a sort of like, you go home at the end of the day and nobody cares. There's a sort of posturing, keep things low, but a lot of the premises are driven by a very small faction, very loud. And it sort of goes to, and I can't remember exactly the law of this, but there's been some interesting political science work done on how much does it actually take to start a revolution? Considering the Olympics are in Paris and that right now, like the French Revolution was really driven by a set of 20% of the populace, largely in Paris and some of the other major metropolitan cities like Nice and areas in Provence, that like it was like 20, 25, 30% of the population that really drove most of it. And as a result, you might think that like that's sort of what's happening at these universities as well. You've got a very loud 20% of the student population and graduate students especially, that are driving most of the discourse, while a lot of people, especially in the hard sciences, are just sort of actually sitting in their labs like such, not doing, the sort of out and out protesting. And so I think that's a result. I also think there's a collective action problem at the level of administration, because I don't think academia right now, and particularly in the more social science oriented areas of academia, they don't have a coherent philosophy anymore. They don't really know what they're doing in the sense of why they're doing what they're doing. They're never asking the first principles question. I've noticed it here. I've noticed it back at my former institution. Like it was always capitulating because they don't know what they're doing. The administration doesn't really understand what the premises of each of their that lead to their conclusions, and so they're very easily cowed. And then you should just note that like basically the entire Weather Underground are all professors now, which says something about academia, right? That like Bernardine Dorn could go and become a professor, and Bill Ayers could go and become a professor. It means there's a lot of capitulation from administration, and a lot of bullshit that happens, a lot of waste, and I think that's a major thing. I also just so I'll just start from there. So I actually don't think the research is in per se corrupted in the fields that actually matter, like CS, like the neurosciences, like certain areas of the medical world. The problem is with the medical students and such is it's admin. It's admin. we are being HR'd to death, and it is that's the problem. And a lot of us think it's bullshit, including the more liberal professors, like even many of my advisors, and they are just annoyed by it. So I think the problem is that universities have an awful PR department, but these are institutions we're saving because they are still make our most of our sense making institutions. They're still the production of our elite, and I would just inquire. Maybe you can say more to that. This, like, where else in history can we derive an elite that is not that doesn't have avenues like the meritocratic systems that may be derived within American academia? That at least, I understand there's concerns about entry, but meritocracy is still, at least when you get to the PhD, and especially when you get to the professoriate level, meritocracy still matters a lot. Tenure actually works pretty well, actually. It's one of these things about getting in an undergrad that I think has some questionable meritocratic issues. But as I say, I know plenty of people who have not gotten tenure because they were bad. They were bad professors. And even if that is the case, again, the counter argument would be someone like Claudine Gay. At least the counter argument is, well, she didn't work to get to where she was. I think that there's a sea change there. And I think that she's more of an anomaly than she is, in fact, a success, certainly in legal academia, maybe less so in political science, but certainly in legal academia. Like, if you're not publishing, good luck, really good luck. So that's where I'll start. I think these are institutions we're saving. I think that slightly overblown, and maybe that's odd to say given my conservative bona fides, but I would say that it's in part because there's too much capitulation on the part of administration, and that administration doesn't, like, these universities actually don't know what they're doing. Like, what's their goal? What are they trying to accomplish when they have undergrads come here? Is it to get a job? Is it to become better people? Is it to be sort of broken down into their constituent parts and built back up again into better, more universalized, stronger thinking citizens? They can't answer that question with some coherence. And that's what's struggling with academia right now. So that's where I'll start. But if you have any jumping off points from that, I think would be good to think.
You said a lot.
I did. Sorry.
So I guess a comment that I would add is basically what you're saying is what people who are actually in institutions generally say. So I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I encounter a lot of people online who have not, with their experience as undergrad, like you're saying, and what they assume is that, and the image that's presented, because I think this is a story that's told throughout basically high school and undergrad, which is that we don't have a meritocracy. There's grade inflation, so your GPA doesn't matter. Anyone, like a 4.0 is not a determinant really of much of anything. Again, I think there's actually evidence to contradict that, but this is kind of a story that people buy into, and they say what really matters is your extracurriculars. And what your extracurriculars are is equivalent to, did you go to Sunday school every year for 4 years or something? Sure. And if you went to Sunday school, whatever that means, you were part of this NGO, you did this internship, you volunteered at this, homeless shelter, whatever that is, you went to Sunday school for 4 years, that determines if you're able to get into an Ivy League. Then now the people who make this criticism haven't actually gone through that process, but this is the story that they have in their head. What they went to is they went to some kind of normal college, right? They went to a regular undergrad program. And then when they're in that undergrad program and they're told, like, here's how you succeed in this class, you figure out what the professor's ideology is, and then you cater to that ideology. Because, again, most people are not doing heavy STEM, And if they are in STEM, their impression of the other departments is, oh, those people are crazy and extreme and they're off in la la land. So again, that narrative just has this inertia where it's like, okay, if I were to go into grad school, or if someone in the humanities was to get into grad school, then it would just be an intensification of that high school process. It's not just Sunday school on Sundays, but it's Sunday school on Saturdays and Wednesdays and Fridays.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, yeah, most people's impression is it's just a Victorian school of manners where you have to learn to regurgitate the right dogma in the right ways. And even to an extent, I mean, there's this term like humiliation ritual. So it's like you have to learn to say the most absurd things. I think, like, I forget which woman was up in front of, I think it was the new, I don't know how to say her first name, but Ketanji Brown Jackson or something.
Yeah.
She,
Brown Jackson. Yeah.
she was, being grilled by Republicans for her confirmation hearings. And they were like, what is a woman? And she's giving these HR responses. And then Republicans point to that and they say, see, look, all they're learning in school is how to, like, say the right words. There's no critical thinking, whatever. So that's the impression that people have from the outside. And as a result, they have adopted this belief that academic institutions are hollow, that nobody is smart anymore. Everyone is dumb. We don't have an intelligent elite. Everybody's incompetent. And therefore, the system's going to collapse. Which, if that was true, like if we did really have like 90 IQ people, in PhD programs on average, then we really would be looking at some kind of a civilizational collapse, I believe. I don't think that's the case. And so talking to people like you and getting that firsthand, because I think there's also statistics. I mean, we could also just like give an IQ test to a bunch of PhD students and figure that out. Yeah. But having that story, like changing that narrative and telling people, like, if you want to change a system, you have to be inside the system. And your point about the French Revolution, I mean, I would actually disagree in the sense that I think the number of active participants initially was much smaller. Now, once the revolution starts, then they start integrating larger numbers of people. But initially, the conspirators who kick it off is a much smaller, closer to that 3% number of like the American revolutionaries. Yeah. So, you need a very small number of people, but the fact is that those people were not just random people off the streets. Those were people who were in the government. Those were people who were bureaucrats and tax collectors, and they, were part of the establishment in a sense. So if people want to change the direction of things, whether they want to do so in an incrementalist and kind of slow way, or whether they want to do that more quickly, the easiest way to do that is to actually work through the institutions of power as they exist, whether that's the academia, whether that's the financial world. Theoretically, you could become a general in the military or something. The problem with that, which I think is just true, I think the reason why people deny it is for selfish reasons. Because it's actually really hard to become a PhD. It's actually really hard to become a general in the military. It's actually really hard to work on Wall Street and make your first $1 million. And so instead of like being like, okay, we just need to be really smart and shut up and do the work, and then we can do something, it's like, it's very self-serving to say, no, they're all just idiots and it's all just going to collapse. And then once it collapses, like people like me will take power. So that's the kind of narrative that a lot of people have. And it's very frustrating. And so I've tried to I've tried to sometimes use the honey and sometimes use the vinegar. And the honey is basically trying to educate people, trying to soften that belief and like encourage them to, maybe if you can't get a PhD, at least support that narrative rather than the former. And then the vinegar is just saying, like, I don't want to be associated with you. But that's my general perspective on this. And we can keep, like, I want to give you the freedom to elaborate and respond to that. But I also want to give you a jumping off point into discussing maybe some of, I mean, you're doing neuroscience, so kind of discussing the actual substance of what you're studying and what interests you about that. Sure. So take that in either direction.
Sure. Well, so first off, I think I'll be totally honest with you. I don't know if it's per se, I took some notes here, but I don't know if it's per se like the PhD IQ problem is completely unfounded. PhD application, PhDs are very much more competitive than I think they used to be. I mean, if you want to get into some of these places, if you want to get into a top 10 program, it's 1%, 2% acceptance rate. You basically have like 15 slots and 500, 600 applicants. It's small, in part because you're getting paid, right? You're salaried. But I would also say that there's this ongoing problem that I've noticed both from the sort of public school side as well as the sort of elite private school side, which is people seem to misunderstand. There's actually a sort of false positive or misdirection that's occurring. I've just noticed at public institutions, specifically the elite public institutions, like out here in California and say like Michigan or that they sort of assume that the institutions like, I don't know, Harvard, Brown, et cetera, are just like really competitive and really difficult. And so they grade intensely. And it's in part because these are larger institutions. And so, you can sort of be a nobody and make your way through as an undergrad. However, the grade inflation, if you look at any of the UGPAs on law school admissions, it's crazy. Some of the stuff, the grade inflation over the years, and that's largely driven by basically the Ivy Leagues and the sort of Ivy Plus, and it's way easier to get A's there, way easier to get A's there than any other institution, including a lot of the public institutions, which are still the primary institutions that educate most of America. So I understand from a sort of proportion question, which institutions are producing our elites are chock full of grade inflated students who think that they deserve certain things. But I would also just say that population wise, most people are still going to the, University of Missouri and University of Minnesota. I mean, these are huge institutions, right? So on that alone, I think people are still getting an education. Now, this past year with some of the encampments and the campus unrest, you won't find me supporting much of any of that. So I think that is ridiculous. Even if they have, though, again, I think some of it is coercive. I don't know how much of an encampment is actually, First Amendment protected, particularly under time, place, and manner restrictions. My significant other works in First Amendment law, and so she too talks a lot about how this just seems sort of irrelevant. So I would just argue from that point that the vast majority of students are still getting degrees at institutions that purport to sort of be education for the everyman. But I would still nevertheless contend that I still don't think, say, the University of Minnesota's of the world understand what they're doing. That is, exactly what is a business degree going to get you, if not an MBA, an undergrad business degree? Like, I'm going to probably insult a bunch of people here, but I don't know what that gets you. I'm not sure the importance of that other than just experience generally. I think collegiate admissions should be much more difficult. And on top of that, I also just think that we do need to move away from an idea that a collegiate degree is anything outside of becoming a research professor or becoming a professor. Like, I still don't quite frankly understand why anyone would want to get a PhD and not become a professor. The amount of people within my cohort and elsewhere that argue this point, like, of course I'm going into industry. I just why? Like, I mean, your first premise should be I should go and get a doctorate for the purpose of becoming a professor. This is not trying to be insulting in any way, but that's the goal. And so I think that that's really key. I think we sort of misunderstand, both institutions misunderstand each other, that, getting into a place like Brown or Harvard or Yale or Stanford is the hard part. But once you're there, it's a bloody joke, from personal experience. But, when you're at a public institution, it's much more difficult. It just is, because they assume that these schools are like that, which is funny because most of these professors and such have their PhDs and degrees from these other institutions. So I find that odd. So I think that that's sort of 2 points on that front. As to the sort of neuroscience and law component, I think experimental jurisprudence has been growing. Well, first off, actually, I'll start from that point. Let's just, if there's any response there, so be it. I think that there are a lot of First Amendment problems within academia at the moment, but that's because we've been HR'd to death, and I think there needs to be mass layoffs. I know that sounds really heartless, but I have this experience in undergrad where I walked into the philosophy department, one of my undergrad degrees, and I remember having to go to get some sort of I don't know what you would call it, sort of it was the, I don't know, figure out what my major, like basically try to figure out how to graduate. And there were 5 people in the main office, just with 3 of them playing solitaire and junk on their computer. And I was like, why are you here? We could hire 4 more professors, or not 4, but 2 more professors, and fire, the other 3 of you, and more academics wouldn't complain about the lack of jobs, and there'd be more teachers, so the more teaching load would be less, and I think more people would be happier. It's the problem is that the administration assumes that this is sort of an extended daycare, quite frankly, and a lot of professors kind of go on with that, in addition to the fact that they simultaneously complain that there are no jobs in academia, which is true. There is a lack of jobs because all the money is being funneled into HR jobs, basically, sort of menial jobs, which are easier to hire, easier to fire, but not, again, asking the fundamental question of what is the purpose of liberal education. We could be like Venezuela or France or elsewhere, where people right out of high school become physicians, and they become, just my familiarity more with Venezuela, like people become lawyers at 22, 23, because they go through their 5-year program. We could do that if we want. We could become physicians at that time, but we can't answer the fundamental question of, okay, well, we're doing this liberal education thing where we read the great books and we have course requirements. Why do that? What is the point of our institution? And my argument is the point of our institution is a rigorous and strong understanding of our liberal foundations. I think everyone should read the classics like Homer, and a classical education is really important. I understand for religious reasons, you can't read the Bible in some cases, though I think it would be kind of important as a Catholic. I think that these things are like really, that's the emphasis we should focus on, because it allows us to sort of think much more complexly, with greater complexity, about our current situation. These problems that we have are not new. they're variations. They're historically analogous in some ways, the principles at least. And there's a lot